Under the shadow of the Iron King, 3 princesses chose passion over their crowns. But the Seine doesn't keep secrets forever. A single silk glove found in the river triggered a ritual of flaying, castration, and blood that didn't just kill 2 men, it paved the way for a century of war. Discover the dark truth of the Tour de Nesle. Under the cover of night, the waters of the Seine at the foot of the Nesle Tower seem like thick black tar, hiding what should not be seen. The guardian on the wall is used to the splashing of the river wave, but tonight the sound is different, heavier and more muffled. From the narrow window of the upper tier, a leather bag flies out, which disappears into the abyss with a resonant splash, and after it an elegant silk glove, embroidered with gold thread, flies into the water. This is not just garbage, it is the remnants of a feast of flesh and audacity, the price of which for accidental witnesses was always the same, eternal silence at the bottom of the river. In the morning, fishermen will find the mutilated body of a young cleric, whose throat was cut with surgical precision, but no one will dare to raise their eyes to the stone giant where the lights of the royal chambers are extinguished. The tower stood as a silent sentinel of the left bank, its shadow stretching long across the muddy banks like a dark finger pointing at the corruption within. This edifice, once built for defense, had become a sanctuary for secrets that could topple a throne. The heavy stones seemed to absorb the screams of the dying and the laughter of the sinful, keeping them locked away from the ears of the common people. Paris in the early 14th century lived in the long shadow of the Iron King, Philip IV. He was a man whose face was often described as a frozen mask of cold marble, devoid of the warmth that usually defines the living. Under his rule, the city was gripped by a rigid discipline that made every citizen look over their shoulder before speaking. Morality was not just a religious concept but a state weapon, enforced by the terrifying spectacle of public executions and the ever-present threat of the Inquisition. It was within this climate of absolute control that the secret life of the tower began to pulse with a rebellious and dangerous energy. The leather sack that plummeted into the Seine contained the remains of a man who had perhaps seen too much of the hidden world above. His death was a necessary footnote in the preservation of a much larger lie, one that involved the very heirs to the French throne. The young cleric was merely a pawn in a game played by those who felt the laws of the Iron King did not apply to their own desires. As his body drifted toward the sea, the evidence of a nightly ritual of excess was momentarily erased, leaving only the cold water to bear witness. This was the cost of royal discretion in a city where the walls themselves seemed to have ears and eyes. The silk glove, sinking slowly through the murky depths, was a silent testament to the audacity of the princesses who inhabited the tower. These women, Marguerite, Blanche, and Jean of Burgundy, were the wives of the king's sons and the future of the dynasty. To them, the Tour de Nesle was not a fortress but a playground where the rigid protocols of the court could be discarded like a heavy cloak. They sought the company of young knights, turning the symbols of their high status into tokens of their betrayal. The golden threads of the glove represented a luxury that felt invincible, a shield of privilege that they believed would protect them from any consequence. The contrast between the public piety of the court and the private debauchery of the tower created a tension that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Every morning, the 3 princesses would join the king for mass, their faces composed in expressions of holy devotion that betrayed nothing of their midnight activities. They wore the finest furs and silks, appearing as the paragons of womanly virtue while the scent of their lovers still lingered in the air of the Nesle. This duality was a dangerous game of mirrors, where one slip of a tongue or one misplaced gift could shatter the illusion and bring the entire weight of the monarchy crashing down upon their heads. In the narrow streets and crowded taverns of the left bank, the commoners whispered about the lights in the tower and the mysterious deaths that seemed to follow the royal visits. The people of Paris were not blind, and the frequent presence of the 2 handsome knights near the fortress did not go unnoticed by those whose survival depended on observing the habits of their betters. These men, brothers of the noble house of d'Aulnay, moved through the city with an air of invulnerability, unaware that their every move was being watched by those who served the interests of the Iron King. Their arrogance was a fuse burning slowly toward a massive explosion of divine right and human vengeance. As the bells of the city rang out the hour of prime, the gates of the Tour de Nesle were locked tight, and the secrets of the night were momentarily put to rest. The guards changed their shifts, the servants began their chores, and the princesses prepared for another day of royal duty. But the leather bag and the silk glove remained in the dark embrace of the river, waiting for the day when the truth would finally surface. The prologue to the fall of the Cape Tions had been written in the silence of the night and the coldness of the water, a story of desire and death that was only just beginning to unfold under the watchful eyes of the stone giant. Paris in the year 1314 was a city of soaring stone spires and stinking, narrow alleys, all huddled under the watchful gaze of the royal palace. The shadows of the towers lengthened over the muddy streets as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow that looked more like dried blood than light. In this era, the city was the heart of Christendom, yet it beat with a rhythm of fear and absolute obedience to the crown. Every stone seemed to have been placed by a hand that demanded order, and every soul within the walls knew that the king's eyes were never truly closed, even in the dead of the night. At the center of this frozen kingdom sat King Philip IV, known to his subjects as the Fair, though his beauty was of a terrifying and inhuman kind. His face was a masterpiece of static perfection, a mask carved from the finest white marble that never betrayed a single emotion, whether he was signing a death warrant or greeting a foreign dignitary. He was the Iron King, a man who had broken the power of the papacy and dismantled the ancient order of the Knights Templar with a cold, calculated efficiency. His presence alone was enough to turn the air in a room to ice, reminding all who stood before him that he was a sovereign who valued the law above all human connection. Inside the sprawling halls of the Palais de la Cite, a heavy silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic chanting of monks or the soft scabbard clink of the royal guard. The air was thick with the scent of expensive incense and old parchment, a sensory reminder of the king's obsession with bureaucracy and divine right. Every movement within the court was dictated by a rigid etiquette that left no room for spontaneity or warmth, turning the royal family into living statues for the public to admire. It was a world of grey stone and silver crosses, where the fire of human passion was viewed as a dangerous impurity that needed to be extinguished for the sake of the state. Morality in Philip's court was not merely a private virtue but a public cult, reinforced by the terrifying proximity of the Inquisition's fires. The king believed that the purity of the royal bloodline was synonymous with the stability of France, and he guarded that purity with a zealot's intensity. Any whisper of scandal was treated as high treason, and any deviation from the path of righteousness was met with the swiftest and most brutal of punishments. This suffocating atmosphere created a facade of perfect holiness, a shimmering surface that hid the rot and the resentment festering in the hearts of those who lived within the golden cage of the Capetian dynasty. Among the figures who navigated this treacherous landscape were the three daughters-in-law of the king, women of high birth and even higher expectations. Marguerite, Blanche, and Jean of Burgundy were the jewels of the court, their presence adding a touch of grace to the otherwise austere surroundings. They appeared as the very embodiment of 14th-century nobility, their movements fluid and their eyes always cast downward in a show of modest piety. To the casual observer, they were the perfect wives for the future kings of France, dutiful and serene, fulfilling their roles as vessels for the continuation of the most prestigious lineage in all of Europe. Marguerite, the wife of the king's eldest son Louis, was a woman of striking beauty and sharp intelligence who found the constraints of the court increasingly unbearable. Her husband, known as Louis the Quarreler, was a man consumed by his own temper and a love for the hunt, leaving his wife to wither in the boredom of her private apartments. Marguerite possessed a spirit that was far too vibrant for the cold halls of the palace, and her resentment grew with every passing day of neglect. She saw the irony of being a queen-in-waiting who was treated like a decorative tapestry, expected to remain silent and motionless while the world moved on outside. Blanche, married to the king's youngest son Charles, shared this sense of quiet desperation, her youthful energy stifled by the weight of royal expectation. Her husband was a man of little substance, more interested in the cut of his tunic and the polish of his boots than the emotional needs of his wife. Blanche lived in a state of perpetual performance, her every smile and gesture carefully rehearsed to avoid the scrutiny of her father-in-law's judgmental gaze. Beneath the heavy velvet of her gowns, her heart beat with a frantic desire for something real, something that the sterile environment of the court could never provide for her hungry soul. The third woman, Jean, was the wife of Philip the Tall, the middle son who was perhaps the most like his father in his cold devotion to the law and the state. Jean was more cautious than her sisters-in-law, yet she was drawn into their orbit by a shared sense of alienation and a need for feminine solidarity. Together, the three Burgundian princesses formed a secret enclave within the heart of the palace, their whispered conversations in the gardens or over embroidery providing a rare outlet for their frustrations. They were bound by their common fate, three women trapped in a world run by men who saw them as nothing more than political assets and dynastic tools. While their husbands were preoccupied with the affairs of the kingdom, the princesses were left to contend with the crushing weight of formal boredom. Louis spent his weeks in the forests of Senlis, chasing stags and arguing with his nobles, while Philip and Charles were immersed in the intricate legalities of the king's administration. The nights in the palace were long and hollow, illuminated only by the flicker of tallow candles and the distant sound of the city's watchmen. In this vacuum of affection and excitement, the minds of the young women began to wander toward forbidden territories, seeking a spark of life in the midst of their gilded funerary existence. It was in this climate of repressed desire that a conspiracy of sensuality began to take root, blossoming in the darkness behind the closed doors of the royal suites. The princesses began to exchange knowing looks that were more than just familial affection, a silent agreement to seek the passion that was denied to them by their station. They found themselves increasingly attracted to the vitality of the world outside the palace walls, a world where the blood ran hot and the rules of the Iron King seemed less absolute. This shift in their internal world was subtle at first, a flicker of rebellion that would soon grow into a fire that would consume them all. The objects of their burgeoning affection were two brothers, Philippe and Gautier d'Aulnay, young knights of the royal guard who possessed the charm and the daring that the royal sons lacked. These men moved through the court with a grace that was not born of etiquette but of a genuine love for life, their laughter a rare and dangerous sound in the halls of the Palais de la Cite. They were the perfect instruments for the princess's rebellion, offering a glimpse of a world where love was not a contract but a raw and intoxicating experience. The first clandestine meetings were small acts of defiance, but they quickly evolved into something far more perilous and profound. Under the heavy velvet and silk of their ceremonial attire, the women began to carry the weight of their secrets like a physical burden. Every public appearance became a test of their resolve, as they stood beside their husbands and the Iron King while their thoughts remained with the forbidden encounters of the previous night. The contrast between their outward piety and their inner turmoil created a tension that was almost palpable, a crack in the marble facade that threatened to reveal the truth to anyone who looked closely enough. They were playing a game with the highest stakes imaginable, risk-taking that bordered on the suicidal in the eyes of the law. The Tour de Nesle, a solitary stone sentinel on the left bank of the Seine, became the stage for this unfolding drama of betrayal and desire. It was a place far enough from the prying eyes of the main palace to offer a semblance of privacy, yet close enough to be reached under the cover of the frequent Parisian mists. The tower represented a space where the rules of the king did not apply, a sanctuary of stone where the princesses could shed their royal identities and become women of flesh and blood once more. It was here that the conspiracy of the three was solidified, a pact of silence and pleasure that would eventually turn the sacred blood of the Capetans into the talk of the marketplace. Jean, though perhaps less involved in the physical affairs than Marguerite and Blanche, acted as the architect of their movements, her sharp mind calculating the risks and the timing of their escapes. She understood the power of the shadow and the utility of the bribe, ensuring that the path to the tower remained clear of those who might report back to the king. In this way, she became the guardian of their shared secret, a role that gave her a sense of agency that she could never find in her marriage. The three women were no longer just sisters-in-law, they were a triumvirate of rebels, united by a dangerous hunger for autonomy in a world that demanded their submission. As the months passed, the audacity of the lovers grew, fueled by the intoxicating thrill of their successful deceptions and the belief that they were beyond the reach of the law. They began to exchange gifts, tokens of their affection that were far too opulent for mere knights and far too personal for casual acquaintances. These items, though small, were the physical manifestations of their betrayal, evidence that could not be easily explained away if found by the wrong hands. The princesses were lulled into a false sense of security, forgetting that the Iron King's network of spies was as vast and invisible as the air they breathed within the city walls. The irony of their situation was that their very success in hiding their affairs only emboldened them to take greater risks, leading them toward an inevitable confrontation with the reality of their world. They believed that their high status offered them a cloak of invisibility, a royal shield that would protect them even if the whispers of their behavior began to circulate among the lower orders of the court. But in the court of Philip the Fair, no one was above suspicion, and the more they indulged in their secret lives, the more they drew the attention of those who sought to maintain the king's rigid vision of moral order. Behind the closed doors of the tower, the air was no longer thick with incense but with the scent of wine, perfume, and the desperate heat of human bodies seeking connection in a cold world. The laughter that echoed within the stone walls was a direct challenge to the silence of the palace, a sonic rebellion that asserted the rights of the heart over the duties of the crown. For a few hours each night, the princesses were the masters of their own destiny, oblivious to the fact that every moment of joy was a brick added to the wall that would eventually entomb them. The conspiracy of sensuality was a fragile thing, built on the shifting sands of desire and the arrogance of youth. The transition from bored royalty to daring adulteresses was now complete, and the stage was set for a tragedy that would reshape the history of France for 100 years. The three women had crossed a line from which there was no returning, their hearts now belonging to the Knights of the Guard rather than the sons of the king. They had transformed the Tour de Nesle from a defensive fortification into a monument of their own defiance, a place where the sacred and the profane collided with devastating force. The storm was gathering over the Seine, its winds carrying the scent of blood and the coming end of a dynasty that had once seemed eternal. The spring of 1314 arrived with a deceptive softness, as the blossoming orchards of the Isle de France filled the air with a sweet, cloying fragrance that masked the stench of the rising river. Into this world of fragile beauty rode Queen Isabella of England, the daughter of the Iron King, returning to her childhood home with a retinue that shimmered in the pale sunlight. Her arrival was greeted with the hollow grandeur of the French court, where every bow was a calculated move and every smile a potential trap. Isabella, known for a temperament as sharp as a flaying knife, moved through the halls of the Palais de la Cite like a storm front waiting for the right moment to break upon the shore. Isabella was not a woman to be trifled with, possessing a mind that had been forged in the fires of the English court's endless intrigues and her own husband's indifference. She walked through the royal galleries with her head held high, her eyes darting between the tapestries and the faces of her brothers' wives, Marguerite, Blanche, and Jean. There was a certain vibrancy in their movements that felt out of step with the funereal sobriety of her father's palace, a secret electricity that crackled whenever they shared a whispered word. The Queen of England sensed a hidden pulse within the masonry of the palace, a rhythm of rebellion that offended her sense of order and royal dignity. The centerpiece of her visit was a magnificent banquet held in the Great Hall, where the lords and ladies of the realm gathered under the watchful eyes of King Philip IV. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted meats and the metallic tang of wine, while the high vaulted ceilings echoed with the polite murmur of 100 conversations. Isabella sat at the high table, a figure of icy grace, observing the dynamics of the court with the detachment of a predator. She watched as her sisters-in-law laughed more freely than was appropriate for the daughters of the crown, their eyes frequently straying toward the lower end of the hall where the younger knights stood. It was during a brief lull in the music that Isabella's attention was caught by two young men whose presence seemed to command an unusual amount of attention from the royal ladies. Philippe and Gautier d'Aulnay were brothers of noble birth, knights of the guard who moved with the effortless arrogance of men who knew they were desired. They were the very picture of chivalric vitality, their tunics perfectly tailored and their swords hanging at their hips with a practiced ease. However, it was not their physical prowess that drew the queen's focus, but the small, luxurious accessories that dangled from their belts, catching the candlelight with every step they took. Fixed to the leather of their belts were two silk purses, or almoners, exquisitely embroidered with golden thread and intricate patterns of lilies and vines. Isabella felt a sudden, sharp jolt of recognition as she stared at the fine needlework, for she had commissioned those very items herself during her previous stay in Paris. They were unique gifts, intended only for the women of the royal house as a token of their shared bond and their high station within the Castration line. To see these symbols of sisterly intimacy displayed on the hips of mere palace guards was an affront that transcended social protocol and pointed toward a much darker and more intimate reality. The realization hit the queen with the force of a physical blow, though her marble-like expression did not flicker for even a second. She remembered the moment she had handed the purses to Marguerite and Blanche, expecting them to be kept as treasures within the private chambers of the palace. The fact that they were now in the possession of the d'Aulnay brothers was a signature of betrayal, a visible proof of a clandestine connection that violated every law of the realm and every oath of marriage. Isabella's mind raced through the implications, connecting the frequent absences of the princesses with the growing rumors of secret meetings at the solitary tower by the river. Instead of making a public scene, Isabella chose the path of cold calculation, her eyes returning to her father who sat like a statue of judgment at the center of the hall. She saw in him the same unwavering devotion to the purity of the crown that she felt in her own veins, a shared understanding that the dynasty was only as strong as the blood that fueled it. The Queen of England knew that the scandal she had just uncovered was a poison that could destroy the very foundation of the French monarchy if left unchecked. She waited for the banquet to conclude, her silence a heavy weight in her chest, as she prepared to deliver a message that would change history. In the deep silence of the king's private study, illuminated only by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, Isabella confronted her father with the evidence of his house's disgrace. She spoke with a precision that left no room for doubt, describing the silk purses and the lingering glances that she had observed throughout the evening. The air in the room seemed to grow thin and cold as she detailed her suspicions, laying bare the possibility that the royal bloodline was being polluted by the common seed of knights. Philip IV listened without interruption, his hands resting motionless on the arms of his chair, his eyes reflecting the fire like two chips of flint. When she finished her report, the king remained silent for a long time, the only sound in the room being the crackle of the hearth and the distant tolling of a church bell. The idea that his own daughters-in-law had turned a royal fortress into a den of iniquity was a violation of everything he had spent his life building. He did not show rage or sorrow, instead, his mind immediately turned to the logistics of verification and the necessity of absolute proof. Philip was a man who understood that a king cannot act on rumors alone, especially when the honor of the crown is at stake, but he also knew that if the accusations were true, the response would have to be total. Under the cloak of the following night, the king mobilized his most trusted and invisible servants, the shadows of the administration who specialized in the art of observation. These were men who could move through the labyrinthine streets of Paris without being seen, their eyes trained to notice the slightest deviation in the patterns of the city's life. They were instructed to establish a permanent watch over the Tour de Nesle and the private exits of the royal palace, documenting every movement and every visitor with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The hunt had begun, and the quarry was unaware that the very walls they used for cover were now being watched by the eyes of the sovereign. The surveillance was conducted from the opposite bank of the Seine, where the spies hid among the piles of timber and the rotting hulls of old boats. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of the tower's silhouette against the moonlit sky, a jagged tooth of stone rising from the dark water. They watched the heavy doors of the fortress, noting the times when the guards seemed to look the other way and when the lanterns in the high windows were extinguished in a specific, rhythmic pattern. The city around them hummed with the normal sounds of nighttime Paris, but for the watchers, the only thing that mattered was the silence that surrounded the isolated tower of the Nesle. The first breakthrough occurred when the observers saw three female figures, heavily cloaked and masked, slipping out of a side postern of the palace and moving toward the riverbank. They moved with a hurried, nervous energy, their boots clicking softly on the cobblestones before they vanished into the mist that clung to the water's edge. A small boat was waiting for them, rowed by a man whose face was obscured by a deep hood, who transported them across the black expanse of the Seine with practiced silence. The spies followed their progress from the shadows, their hearts beating with the realization that they were witnessing the literal crossing of a line that led toward destruction. As the boat touched the stone steps of the Tour de Nesle, the figures were greeted by two men who emerged from the darkness of the lower gate. The brothers d'Aulnay did not bow or offer the formal greetings required by their station, instead, they reached out with an intimacy that confirmed Isabella's darkest suspicions. The group disappeared into the interior of the tower, and shortly thereafter, lights began to flicker in the upper chambers, casting long, dancing shadows against the cold masonry. The watchers could hear the faint sound of laughter and the clinking of goblets through the thick walls, a sound of revelry that felt like a direct assault on the dignity of the nearby palace. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was a world away from the frozen morality of the king's court, a sanctuary where the princesses could finally shed the heavy masks of their public roles. Marguerite and Blanche surrendered to the passion they had been denied, their voices echoing in the vaulted rooms as they shared wine and secrets with their lovers. They felt invincible in their stone fortress, believing that the river and the night were their allies in keeping the truth buried. They did not know that every touch and every word was being noted by the men in the shadows, who were gathering the materials that would soon be used to construct their metaphorical and literal funeral pyres. The most terrifying aspect of the discovery for the king's spies was the realization of the biological threat this affair posed to the future of France. In an age where the legitimacy of the heir was the only thing standing between order and civil war, the thought of a bastard child being placed on the throne was a nightmare of existential proportions. If the princesses were pregnant, there would be no way to tell if the father was a future king or a common soldier of the guard. This was not just a sin of the flesh, it was a political assassination of the dynasty itself, a poisoning of the well from which all future authority was supposed to flow for the next 100 years. As the surveillance continued over several nights, the volume of evidence grew until it became a mountain of undeniable proof. The spies documented the regularity of the meetings, the exchanges of jewelry and more embroidered silk, and the blatant disregard for the sanctity of the marriage bed. They saw Jean of Burgundy acting as the sentinel and the facilitator, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows while her sisters-in-law indulged in their illicit desires. The conspiracy of the three was laid bare, a network of feminine solidarity that had successfully deceived the most powerful men in Europe, but which was now being dismantled piece by piece by his invisible and relentless agents. The final report was delivered to King Philip in the early hours of a rainy morning, the parchment damp with the moisture of the river and the gravity of its contents. The king read through the descriptions of his daughters-in-law's behavior with a face that remained as impassive as the stone walls of his palace, though those close to him noticed a tightening of the jaw that signaled a coming storm. He saw the names of the d'Aulnay brothers and the detailed accounts of their arrival at the tower, and he knew that the time for observation had ended. The honor of the Capetans had been dragged through the mud of the Seine, and the only way to cleanse it was through a ritual of blood. The dawn that broke over Paris in April 1314 carried with it a biting wind that seemed to whistle through the very marrow of the city's bones. The secret that had festered in the shadows of the Tour de Nesle was no longer a whispered rumor but a weapon of state, gripped firmly in the iron fist of King Philip IV. There was no room for the soft mercy of family ties or the hesitation of blood when the sanctity of the Capetan crown was at stake. The arrest of the brothers d'Aulnay was executed with a silent, terrifying efficiency that left no room for escape, as the king's men descended upon their quarters like a sudden, inescapable frost. Philippe and Gautier d'Aulnay, once the golden ornaments of the royal court, found themselves stripped of their finery and thrown into the lightless pits of the palace dungeons before the city had even fully awakened. Their laughter, which had once echoed through the stone halls of the tower, was replaced by the clatter of heavy chains and the cold realization that their world had ended. The Iron King did not seek an explanation or a plea for forgiveness, he sought a purification of the lineage through a ritual of absolute pain. The legal process was a mere formality, a swift march toward a theater of cruelty designed to sear the lesson of their transgression into the memory of France. The king decreed that the punishment must be as public as the sin was private, choosing the town of Pontoise as the stage for this gruesome spectacle. A massive wooden scaffold was erected in the center of the marketplace, rising like a dark altar against the pale spring sky. Thousands of commoners and nobles alike gathered, drawn by a morbid fascination with the fall of such high-flying favorites. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the nervous energy of the crowd, who watched in a state of enchanted horror as the two brothers were dragged toward their final destination, their noble status now nothing more than a memory. The brothers were forced to endure a physical ordeal that defied the limits of human endurance, a systematic deconstruction of the body intended to mirror the deconstruction of their honor. In front of the rapturous and terrified audience, the executioners began the process of flaying, peeling the skin from their living bodies as if they were nothing more than livestock. The screams that ripped from their throats were lost in the roar of the wind, a raw and guttural sound that served as a grim soundtrack to the king's vengeance. Every inch of exposed muscle and bone was a testament to the fact that no one, regardless of their charm or beauty, was beyond the reach of the law. As the morning sun reached its zenith, the horror intensified with the act of castration, a symbolic removal of the very tools of their betrayal. This was a deliberate statement by Philip IV, a declaration that the seed which had dared to threaten the royal succession would be utterly and violently extinguished. The ground beneath the scaffold became slick with blood, turning the dusty marketplace into a slaughterhouse where the pride of the d'Aulnay house was ground into the dirt. The crowd watched in a trance of collective trauma, witnessing the literal shredding of the chivalric ideal that these men had once embodied so effortlessly. The final act of mercy came only after every other torment had been exhausted, as the heavy axe of the executioner fell to claim their heads. The silence that followed the dull thud of the blade was more profound than any scream, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull the very air out of the lungs of those watching. The mutilated bodies were not given the dignity of a burial but were instead dragged through the streets and hung from a gibbet, left to rot in the open air as a carrion feast. This was the visual legacy of the Tour de Nesle, a lingering and putrid reminder that the bed of a queen was a place of death for any who entered it without a crown. While the brothers died in the mud of Pontoise, a different but equally devastating fate was being prepared for the princesses Marguerite and Blanche within the cold walls of the palace. The women who had once dictated the fashions of Europe were subjected to a ritual of humiliation that stripped them of every vestige of their royal identity. By order of the king, their heads were shaved bald, their long locks of hair falling to the stone floor like the discarded plumage of fallen birds. The loss of their hair was not merely a cosmetic change but a profound symbolic castration of their own, a public marking of their fall from grace and their new status as outcasts. They were forced to trade their heavy silks and delicate furs for the rough, biting texture of coarse woolen smocks, the kind worn by the lowliest of penitents. These garments were designed to irritate the skin and serve as a constant physical reminder of their sin, a sackcloth of shame that they would wear for the rest of their lives. Marguerite and Blanche, once the symbols of youthful vitality and feminine power, were reduced to shivering, hollow-eyed ghosts of their former selves. The transition was so abrupt and so total that it felt as if they had already died, their souls having departed with the first stroke of the razor against their scalps. The king's judgment dictated that they be hidden away from the world, entombed in the grim and formidable fortress of Chateau Gallard. This castle, perched high on a limestone cliff overlooking the Seine, was a place built for war, not for the delicate lives of princesses. Its walls were thick with the damp of the river and the cold of the Norman winter, a fortress of grey stone that seemed to exhale a sense of hopelessness. As the heavy iron gates groaned shut behind them, the princesses were plunged into a world of perpetual twilight, where the only sound was the drip of water against the cold masonry and the distant calling of crows. Their cells were narrow and lightless, stripped of any comfort that might remind them of the warmth they had once found in each other's company or the arms of their lovers. The dampness of the walls seeped into their bones, bringing with it a deep and aching chill that no amount of prayer could dispel. In the silence of their confinement, the memories of the nights at the Tour de Nesle must have felt like a cruel hallucination, a dream of fire and silk that had led them directly into this frozen purgatory. They were no longer queens in waiting, but prisoners of a state that demanded their total erasure from the public consciousness. The psychological weight of their imprisonment was designed to be as corrosive as the physical conditions of the dungeon. They were kept in isolation, denied the companionship that had once been the bedrock of their rebellion, left alone with nothing but the echoes of their own thoughts and the crushing weight of their guilt. The king intended for the moisture of the stone to slowly wash away their spirit, turning their vibrant minds into dull, compliant shadows. Every hour spent in the gloom of Chateau Gallard was a slow-motion execution of their identities, a grinding down of the soul until nothing remained but the basic instinct to survive in the dark. Jean of Burgundy, though she had been the facilitator of the affair, was treated with a slightly less brutal hand, largely due to the influence of her husband, Philip the Tall. While her sisters-in-law rotted in the dungeons, she was placed under a form of house arrest in the fortress of Dordogne, her fate still hanging in the balance. This disparity in punishment created a new kind of tension within the family, a lingering resentment that would further poison the relationships between the surviving Capetillons. Even in her relative comfort, Jean was a pariah, a woman whose name was now synonymous with the betrayal that had brought the House of France to its knees. The news of the executions and the imprisonment sent a shockwave through the courts of Europe, shattering the illusion of the Iron King's perfect family. The scandal was no longer a secret contained within the walls of a tower but a subject of fascinated gossip in every marketplace from London to Rome. The blood of the d'Aulnay brothers had stained the reputation of the French monarchy in a way that no amount of public piety could ever clean. Philip IV had achieved his goal of purification, but at the cost of turning his dynasty into a spectacle of tragedy and his heirs into objects of pity and scorn. As the weeks turned into months, the silence within Chateau Gallard became a physical presence, a heavy shroud that smothered any hope of a royal pardon. The Iron King did not look back, his gaze fixed firmly on the administration of his realm and the preservation of his legacy, seemingly indifferent to the suffering of his own kin. He had traded the lives and happiness of his family for the cold stability of the law, a bargain that he accepted with the same stoicism he brought to every other aspect of his rule. The princesses were forgotten by the world, their names removed from the liturgies and their images blurred in the minds of the people they had once ruled. In the damp darkness of her cell, Marguerite of Burgundy began to succumb to the physical toll of her environment, the cough in her lungs growing deeper with every passing season. The memories of the silk glove and the leather sack were now just ghosts that haunted the corners of her vision, reminders of a life that had been forfeited for a few hours of stolen warmth. She was the living proof of the king's ultimate power, a woman who had dared to seek a heart in a world made of marble and had been crushed by its weight. The tragedy of the Tour de Nesle had reached its brutal crescendo, leaving behind only the cold stone and the relentless flow of the Seine. The finality of the retribution was a clear signal that the era of the Iron King would tolerate no deviation from the path of absolute order. The flayed skin of the knights and the shaven heads of the princesses were the icons of a new, harsher reality where the needs of the state outweighed the desires of the individual. As the year 1314 progressed, the Kingdom of France stood as a monument to Philip's will, yet beneath the surface, the cracks were widening. The blood spilled in Pontoise was seed sown in a field of bitterness, destined to harvest a century of conflict that no one could yet foresee. The Iron King did not long survive the fires he had lit in the hearts of his family and his kingdom. In November of 1314, during a hunt in the forest of Pont Saint-Maxence, a sudden stroke felled the men who had seemed as immortal as the stone of his palace. Some whispered that the curse of the Grand Master of the Templars, uttered from the flames of the pyre months earlier, had finally found its mark in the king's cold blood. Philip IV left behind a kingdom that was administratively perfect but spiritually hollowed out by his own relentless pursuit of absolute control and moral purity. The crown passed to his eldest son, Louis X, a man whose nickname the Quarreler hinted at the volatility and weakness that now sat upon the throne of France. Louis inherited a realm in turmoil and a marriage that was a public disgrace, with his wife Marguerite still rotting in the damp darkness of Chateau Gallard. He was a king haunted by the specter of his wife's adultery, unable to produce a legitimate heir while his first marriage remained legally binding in the eyes of the church. The shadow of the Tour de Nesle followed him into the royal bedchamber, making every move he made toward the future feel like a desperate struggle against the past. In the spring of 1315, the situation reached a grim resolution when Marguerite of Burgundy was found dead in her cell at the age of 25. The official cause was the harshness of her confinement and the chill of the Norman stone, but the timing was too convenient for the king who desperately needed to remarry. Whether she succumbed to the slow poison of despair or a more deliberate hand, her passing cleared the way for Louis to wed Clementia of Hungary. Yet the air of the palace remained thick with the scent of tragedy, and the new queen's arrival could not fully erase the stains left by the shaven-headed prisoner of the Seine. Louis X's reign was as brief as it was troubled, lasting less than 2 years before he too was claimed by a sudden and mysterious ailment. After a vigorous game of tennis at Vincennes in the heat of June 1316, the king drank a large quantity of chilled wine and collapsed into a fever from which he never recovered. He died leaving his second wife pregnant and his kingdom without a clear successor, a situation that the Castration dynasty had not faced in over 300 years. The sudden vacuum of power invited the very chaos that Philip the Fair had spent his entire life trying to prevent through the mechanisms of iron law. The birth of a posthumous son, John I, offered a flicker of hope that the direct line might continue, but the child's life was a mere heartbeat in the history of the nation. King John reigned for only 5 days before he was carried to the royal crypt in a tiny shroud, leaving his uncle, Philip the Tall, to seize the crown amidst a storm of rumors and accusations. The infant's death was a crushing blow to the stability of the realm, and many began to see the unfolding disaster as a divine judgment upon a family that had traded its humanity for the cold mechanics of power and the brutal public shaming of its own women. Philip V, the middle son, was perhaps the most capable of the Iron King's heirs, yet he was forced to begin his reign with a legal sleight of hand to secure his position. He convened an assembly of prelates and nobles in 1317 to declare that women were incapable of inheriting the crown of France. This maneuver was specifically designed to bypass Marguerite's daughter, Joan, whose legitimacy had been permanently tainted by the scandal of the Tour de Nesle. The doubt sown in the tower by a silk glove and a leather sack had now hardened into a fundamental law of the state, altering the course of French succession forever. The exclusion of women from the throne was not merely a matter of ancient tradition, but a direct reaction to the fear of the adulteress's brood polluting the royal line. Every female descendant was now viewed through a lens of suspicion, her very existence a reminder of the night when the princesses had invited knights into the sanctuary of the Nesle. This atmosphere of distrust created a deep fracture in the foundation of the monarchy, turning the concept of royal blood into a subject of legal debate and tavern gossip. The female solidarity in vice had successfully introduced a poison of uncertainty that no amount of royal decrees could fully neutralize. Philip the Tall ruled with an efficiency that mirrored his father's, attempting to reform the currency and standardize weights and measures across the kingdom. However, his personal life was a mirror of the dynastic failure that seemed to be haunting his house like a vengeful ghost. Despite his efforts and his devotion to the crown, he failed to produce a surviving male heir, leaving behind only daughters who were now barred from the throne by the very law he had helped to establish. As his health began to decline in 1322, the realization that the crown would pass to his last remaining brother, Charles, cast a somber light over his final days. In the freezing January of 1322, Philip V died at the age of 28, leaving a kingdom that was technically orderly but biologically stagnant. The swiftness with which the sons of the Iron King were being removed from the stage of history was beginning to feel like a calculated erasure by a higher power. 3 kings had occupied the throne in less than 8 years, and none had managed to plant a secure root for the future of the direct Castration line. The transition to the youngest brother, Charles, was met with a sense of weary inevitability rather than the hopeful fanfare that usually accompanied a new coronation. Charles IV, the Fair, took the throne with a heavy heart and a marriage that was still technically tied to the imprisoned Blanche of Burgundy. Blanche remained a captive, her mind shattered by years of isolation and the memory of her husband's complicity in her public humiliation and the execution of her lover. In 1322, Charles finally secured an annulment from the Pope on the grounds of spiritual affinity, allowing him to remarry in a desperate bid to produce a male heir. Blanche was eventually moved to a convent, where she lived out her final days as a ghost of the vibrant princess who had once danced in the Tour de Nesle. Charles IV's search for an heir became a frantic race against the biological clock and the perceived curse that seemed to be tightening its grip on the family. He married Marie of Luxembourg, but she and her infant son died shortly after a carriage accident in 1324. His third marriage to Joan of Evreux brought a momentary hope, but as the years passed, it became clear that the direct line of the Castatians was reaching its terminal point. The palace halls, once bustling with the energy of a sprawling royal family, now echoed with the silence of a house that was slowly but surely going dark as the seasons turned. Throughout these years, the legacy of the three sisters-in-law remained the unspoken center of gravity for the kingdom's political maneuvers. Their actions had not only led to their own destruction but had effectively dismantled the patriarchal certainty of the longest-running dynasty in Europe. Every legal decision, every marriage contract, and every royal funeral was conducted under the long shadow cast by the events of 1314. The princesses had sought a moment of individual freedom, but the ripples of their choice had turned into a tidal wave that was now sweeping away the very crown they were supposed to protect and perpetuate. By the year 1328, the biological fate of the Castatians was sealed as Charles IV lay on his deathbed at the age of 33. Like his brothers before him, he had failed to leave a living son to take his place, marking the end of 341 years of direct father-to-son succession. This extraordinary run of biological luck had finally run dry, leaving the kingdom on the precipice of a succession crisis that would involve the most powerful noble houses of Europe. The great Castration tree, which had once sheltered all of France, was now a hollowed-out husk, waiting for the first strong wind to topple it into the mud of history. The death of Charles IV in February 1328 signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a profound uncertainty for the French people. The direct descendants of Hugh Capet were gone, leaving only the collateral branches of the family to fight over the scraps of the royal authority. The transition of the crown to the House of Valois was not a smooth process but a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of continuity in a world that had lost its center. The Iron King's vision of a monolithic and unified state was now being torn apart by the very same forces of blood and legitimacy that he had tried to weaponize. There is a cruel irony in the fact that Philip the Fair's obsession with the purity of the royal bloodline directly contributed to its extinction. By publicly exposing the scandal of the Tour de Nesle and forcing a legal definition of legitimacy that excluded daughters, he narrowed the path of succession until it became a dead end. His refusal to allow for the slightest stain on the honor of the crown ensured that when the male line failed, there was no graceful way for the female line to step in and save the dynasty. The king who sought to build a monument of eternal law instead constructed a tomb for his own name and his own children. The once mighty dynasty was now reduced to a dry stump, its branches broken and its leaves withered by a decade of internal trauma and biological failure. The sons of Philip the Fair had lived through a nightmare of their father's making, watching as their wives were disgraced and their lovers flayed, only to find themselves unable to create a new future. They were kings in name only, placeholders for a destiny that had already been decided in the dark waters of the Seine. The kingdom of France stood at a crossroads, weakened by a generation of rapid turnover and the lingering stench of a scandal that refused to be buried by the passage of time. The female solidarity in vice, as the court chroniclers had labeled the actions of the three princesses, had proven to be a more effective force for destruction than any foreign army. Marguerite, Blanche, and Jean had not intended to destroy a kingdom, but their pursuit of a private life had shattered the public myth of the divine monarchy. Their rebellion was a symptom of a world where women were treated as pawns, and their ultimate revenge was the involuntary dismantling of the board on which the game was played. The cruelty of their punishment only served to amplify the impact of their original transgression, turning a domestic scandal into a national catastrophe. As 1328 drew to a close, the geopolitical vacuum created by the Castration collapse began to draw in the predatory gaze of neighboring powers. To the north, the King of England, Edward III, watched the chaos in Paris with a mounting interest that was born of his own mother's memories and her claim to the French throne. Isabella, the she-wolf of France who had first pointed out the silk purses in the Tower, was now the mother of a man who could claim to be the rightful heir to her father's kingdom. The seeds of the 100 Years' War were being watered by the same river that had once hidden the leather sack of a dead cleric. The era of the Iron King had ended not with a bang of military conquest but with the silent, creeping rot of a family that had forgotten how to love and how to live. The Tour de Nesle stood as a dark monument to the transition between the High Middle Ages and the century of blood and fire that was to follow. The story of the queens who chose knights over kings had become a foundational myth for the new, more brutal France that was emerging from the wreckage of the old order. The dynasty was dead, but the memory of the scandal would live on in the chronicles, a cautionary tale about the high cost of a moment of stolen passion. 2 decades had passed since the silence of the grave had claimed the last of the direct sons of the Iron King, yet the air of France remained heavy with the scent of old blood. The year 1337 marked a threshold where the ghosts of the past finally stepped into the daylight to demand a massive and terrible sacrifice. King Edward III of England, the grandson of Philip the Fair, sat upon his throne in London and looked toward the coast of France with eyes that burned with a cold, hereditary fire. He was no longer a child listening to his mother Isabella's whispers, he was a monarch who understood that the crown of the Castilians was a fruit hanging from a dying tree. The formal justification for the coming storm was rooted in the very same scandal that had once turned the Tour de Nesle into a house of mourning. Edward argued that the legitimacy of the French succession had been irreparably broken by the infidelity of the princesses and the subsequent exclusion of women from the throne. He pointed to the silk purses and the embroidered gloves as symbols of a moral rot that had disqualified the current Valois branch from ruling the sacred land. What had once been a private family shame was now rebranded as a legal pivot for the greatest conflict in the history of medieval Europe, a war of words that would soon become a war of iron. As the declaration of war echoed through the courts of Christendom, the irony of Philip the Fair's legacy began to manifest in its most grotesque and devastating form. The king who had sought to preserve the purity of his blood through public flaying and the imprisonment of his own kin had inadvertently ensured the extinction of his line. By insisting on a standard of perfection that no human family could possibly maintain, he had left his kingdom vulnerable to the ambitions of a foreign predator. The marble mask of the Iron King had finally cracked, and through those fissures, the dogs of war were let loose to roam the beautiful valleys and vineyards of France for over a century. The onset of the conflict, which would later be known as the 100 Years' War, transformed the kingdom into a scorched earth where the smoke of burning villages blotted out the sun. The silk and gold of the court were replaced by the cold steel of the longbow and the jagged edges of broken stone as the English armies cut a path of destruction across the land. Every charge of the knights and every cry of the dying was a direct consequence of the knights in the tower, a debt of passion that was now being repaid in the currency of millions of lives. The country that the Iron King had built with such meticulous cruelty was being systematically dismantled by the grandson he had never truly known. In the mud of Crécy and the tall grass of Poitiers, the pride of the French nobility was ground into the dirt, echoing the humiliation of the brothers d'Aulnay in the square of Pontoise. The high walls of the cities could not protect the people from the famine and plague that followed in the wake of the marauding armies, creating a landscape of perpetual sorrow. The irony was suffocating. The quest for a pure succession had resulted in a contested throne that brought only death and desolation to the very subjects the king was sworn to protect. France was no longer a monument to royal dignity but a charnel house where the common man paid the price for the sins of the elite. As the decades dragged on, the memory of Marguerite, Blanche, and Jean faded into the background of a much larger and more terrifying narrative of national survival. Yet, their presence remained in every legal argument and every diplomatic maneuver that prolonged the slaughter of the innocent. The 3 women who had simply wished to feel the heat of a human touch in the cold stone of the Nesle had accidentally set fire to the entire world. Their desire for a momentary escape from the boredom of the palace had become the catalyst for a century of agony, proving that in the game of kings, the smallest spark of rebellion can ignite a conflagration that consumes generations. The fields of France, once fertile and teeming with life, became a tapestry of ash and bone where the only growth was the weeds of despair and the black crosses of the nameless dead. The grand cathedrals that Philip the Fair had patronized now stood as silent witnesses to the desecration of the land, their bells tolling not for celebrations but for the endless funeral of a nation. The royal line of the Valois struggled to hold back the tide, their authority weakened by the very doubts that Edward of England had so skillfully exploited. It was a time of darkness where the light of the Castilian sun had been replaced by the flickering, sickly glow of a dying embers. There is a profound bitterness in the realization that the fanatical pursuit of moral cleanliness led directly to the most prolonged period of filth and depravity in French history. Philip's belief that he could control the hearts of his family through terror had backfired with a cosmic intensity, proving that the law is a blunt instrument when used against the complexities of the human spirit. The extinction of his direct male line was not just a biological failure but a symbolic judgment on a man who had forgotten that a kingdom is made of people, not just principles. The void he left behind was filled with the screams of the dying and the stench of unburied corpses. Ultimately, the salvation of France did not come from the decrees of lawyers or the tactical brilliance of the high-born, but from the raw and desperate courage of the common people. It was the blood of the peasants, the artisans, and the minor gentry that finally washed away the stains of the Tour de Nesle and the 100 Years' War. They fought not for the purity of a royal bloodline that had already failed them, but for the soil beneath their feet and the right to exist in a world that had been shattered by the whims of their betters. The commoners became the true guardians of the realm, paying in sweat and agony for the luxury of royal intrigue. The final emotional weight of this story lies in the contrast between the 3 women in the tower and the millions of nameless victims who followed them into the abyss. Marguerite and Blanche had sought life in a tomb, and in doing so, they had turned their entire country into a tomb for the next 4 generations. The fear that gripped the hearts of the mothers in the burning villages was the same fear that had once been locked away in the dungeons of Château Gallard, but amplified to a national scale. The tragedy was no longer personal, it was atmospheric, a permanent part of the French identity that would take centuries to heal and forgive. As the smoke finally cleared in the mid-15th century, the map of Europe had been redrawn by the blood of the innocent, leaving the Castration dynasty as nothing more than a footnote in a chronicle of loss. The Tour de Nesle itself remained a silent monument to the fragility of power and the devastating impact of repressed desire, its stones soaked with the echoes of ancient laughter and screams. The irony was complete: the king who wanted an eternal legacy left behind a landscape of ruin, and the women who wanted a moment of love left behind a century of hatred. The cost of their humanity was a price that an entire civilization was forced to pay in full. We are left with the image of the Seine flowing past the empty site of the tower, its waters indifferent to the blood of the clerics, the knights, and the kings that it has carried to the sea. The story of the queens who drowned a scandal in the river only to see it rise as a tidal wave of war is a warning that the pursuit of absolute control always breeds absolute chaos. France survived, but it was a different France, one forged in the fires of a suffering that began with a single silk glove and a leather sack. The spirits of the 3 women still linger in the mists of the left bank, a reminder that the heart can never be fully imprisoned by the stone. The final reckoning of the Castatians is a testament to the fact that power is a hollow thing when it is divorced from the basic needs of the human soul for warmth and connection. The Iron King's failure was not one of administration or war, but of a fundamental misunderstanding of the people he ruled, starting with his own children. He built a cage of gold and marble and was surprised when the birds within began to peck at the bars until they bled. In the end, the blood of the simple people saved the crown, but it could not save the memory of the men who had let the kingdom burn to satisfy his own cold and relentless sense of justice. The history of the Tour de Nesle is not just a tale of adultery and execution, but a haunting reflection on how the private lives of the powerful can dictate the public fate of the world. The indignation of the betrayed husbands, the fear of the imprisoned princesses, and the anger of the dispossessed heirs all combined to create a storm that nearly wiped France from the map. It is a story that should evoke a deep and unsettling reaction, a realization that our modern world is built on the ruins of such ancient and intimate tragedies. The dead are gone, but the echoes of their choices still resonate in the stone and the soil of the city. Looking back across the centuries, the figure of Philip the Fair remains a chilling enigma, a man who traded the lives of his family for a vision of order that vanished within a decade of his death. His sons died without heirs, his daughters-in-law died in disgrace, and his kingdom was nearly lost to the sons of his enemies. There is a sense of cosmic malice in how perfectly the trap he set for others eventually snapped shut on his own throat. The irony of the silk purses is a bitter pill to swallow, a reminder that the symbols of our pride are often the very tools used by fate to orchestrate our total and final undoing. As the lights fade on this dark chapter of the Middle Ages, the silence of the Seine remains the only answer to the questions raised by the tower. Was the price of a few nights of passion worth the lives of millions, or was the cruelty of the king the true engine of the catastrophe? There is no comfort to be found in the historical record, only the cold facts of the flaying knives and the burning rafters of the French countryside. The story ends as it began, in the darkness of the river, where the truth is buried beneath layers of silt and the heavy weight of 100 years of human suffering and royal pride.